So today we're going to talk about, and this week I should say, cell membranes and transport. So a lot of detail on how things get into and out of the cell. That's going to be the main focus. So cell membranes and transport. You may remember the basic eukaryotic cell. It is composed of a plasma membrane that surrounds the entire cell, a nucleus that contains the genetic information, and then the cytoplasm, which is the cytosol along with the organelles. We talked about some of those organelles last week. So this week we're going to focus on the plasma membrane and the components of it, and then how we get things in and out of it. So it's separating the extracellular fluid from the intracellular fluid, ICF and ECF. That's one important thing it does. And then it can control, it can selectively let some things in and not other things, and out as well. So we're able to have the homeostasis of what's inside the cell be different than what's outside of the cell. And that's really important. So the plasma membrane is made up of, it doesn't look like these two lines here. This is what it actually looks like. So, I mean, this is a schematic of what it actually looks like, the actual components in it. So the main component is what? Phospholipids. These are the yellow part here. I'll talk more about them in a bit, but they are what actually allow this structure, stable circle to form. Super important. And they're lipids. Next, we have cholesterol, also a lipid. There is less of that. It's embedded in the membrane, and it's going to provide rigidity, firmness, and then less cholesterol means the membrane is going to be more fluid. So it's something that varies in different cells, depending on the function of that cell. Remember, cholesterol is also a lipid, and proteins, super important. Proteins will be the focus of our discussion of the plasma membrane. So some examples of proteins shown here. Here's a channel. This is a transmembrane protein because it's going trans or through, across a cell. Trans means across. There are peripheral proteins. Here's an example of one on the periphery, so one end or the other. The cytoskeletal proteins down here, so the filaments, are other examples of peripheral proteins. Peripheral proteins are super important, but we will be focusing on these transmembrane proteins. Sometimes you'll see them called integral proteins and other sources that actually are embedded within the membrane and have various functions. I'll come back to them briefly in just a moment. The last one I want to mention here is the glycolipids and glycoproteins. These are these proteins and lipids that have carbohydrate chains sticking off of them. The carbohydrate chain is really the part that's different here. Glyco refers to the carbohydrate, like glycogen. So those glycolipids and glycoproteins, all these carbohydrate chains sticking off of the external side, the outside of the membrane, all make up the glycocalyx. This is a fuzzy coat around the whole membrane that has several functions. I'm just going to talk about it now, and it might come up in some ways in the future a bit, but it won't be a huge focus. So it's protection, first of all, kind of fuzzy coat that literally helps protect. Then these carbohydrate chains are all unique to different cells and different organisms. So they act as ID tags. So the cells can recognize self versus cells, foreign cells, so important for immune detection, as well as has implications for transfusion of organs and blood, because those, if you get a blood transfusion, those cells have different tags, and that's the background behind the blood types, ABO blood types as well. Additionally, these carbohydrate chains are involved in cell adhesion, so sticking to other cells, and several other functions in terms of like development and fertilization as well. Okay, so back to the general idea of the proteins, and then we'll get into the details in the future lectures. So these are different types of membrane proteins that I wanted to introduce to you, the variety of them, and then we'll get into focusing on some of them more now. So here we've got receptors, super important. We'll come back to signaling, right? You've got a chemical messenger that's either a neurotransmitter or a hormone typically that binds to a receptor and causes some effect. We'll get into those. Enzymes, so you know what enzymes are. Enzymes can be within the membrane, and it's a way to break down products right here in the membrane. Channels, there's two types of channels here. These purple ones are both channels, meaning something goes through them, just like a channel for water. Some channels are always open. These are called leak channels. They're non-gated, they're just open. They allow stuff to flow through if there's a gradient for it to flow through. Gated channels are sometimes closed, sometimes open. They require something to open, and we'll go into the types of stimuli that cause them to open later. So these are both channels, literally channels. Carrier proteins are a little bit different, and for some reason are not in this image. I'll get into those when we talk about glucose transport later in this lecture series. So these two types, as well as carriers, will be the focus of membrane transport, which is the focus of this week. I'll talk a little bit about receptors, and the rest of these we won't talk a whole lot about. So these last two are related to those those carbohydrate chains. We've got cell identity markers. So this is the glycoproteins that have that identity marker, so you can tell self from non-self. And then adhesion is the other thing I mentioned with those carbohydrates. These cell adhesion molecules, or CAMs, allow cells to adhere to other cells. So those are two other types of proteins in the membrane. Again, the focus will be on transport proteins, which are these today. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about a receptor protein as well, a G protein coupled receptor. So what this is name and briefly describe the properties and components of the plasma membrane. So ignore these down here for now. Phospholipid bilayer, membrane proteins, transmembrane proteins, also called proteins, peripheral proteins, cholesterol, glycolipids, and glycocalyx. I could have glycoproteins up there as well. And then the second one is name and briefly describe the types of membrane proteins in the membrane. So these are those actual functions. Notice I have carrier on here of the membrane proteins that we just talked about. All right, stay tuned for the next.